At the party, I overheard my wife's friend share something shocking about her affair with another man, and each word was like a slap in the face amid the smiles all around. I waited for the evening to end, looked at my wife, and said, "Now I understand all the silences." The next day, I left home with dignity and pain. She tried to continue with her lover, but soon discovered it was just his whim. She was left alone, dealing with her own emptiness. I slowly started over, and found a new love who looked at me truthfully and chooses me every day. Months later, she came to me remorseful, asking for forgiveness. I offered mine, respectfully, but made it clear that the past cannot be undone. We went our separate ways, and that was when she understood the weight of her choice. But that wasn't all. None of it happened in a straight line, like someone cutting a rope and watching everything fall to the ground at once. The pain doesn't come like that. It comes in spasms, in slow waves, like a poison that slowly runs through the body while the face still forces a smile. I was in the middle of a room full of lights, friends, clinking glasses, and while everyone laughed, I was dying. Slowly. Silently. And the cruelest thing of all was how much I still loved her. How much I believed she was just going through a difficult time, that her silence these past few weeks was fatigue, stress, some kind of melancholy that would soon pass. She was distracted, and I pretended not to notice. She hugged me less eagerly, and I thought it was all in my head. She no longer posted pictures of us, and I told myself it was because she was too busy. But that night, at that damned party, everything fell apart. I didn't even want to go. It was a get-together between mutual friends, and I could already sense her discomfort when I mentioned we might show up. The look she gave me was dry, like someone reminded of something uncomfortable. She hesitated, but eventually relented. She dressed with a care she hadn't shown me in a while, her makeup impeccable, the same perfume she wore when we went out to dinner in the first months of our relationship. For a second, I thought it was for me. Idiot. She was getting ready for a ghost I hadn't yet met, but who was already inhabiting her. We arrived together, but she soon wandered off to chat with her friends. I stood in the corner, chatting with a few acquaintances, trying to appear composed. Until I heard it. It wasn't for me. It was a muffled conversation, whispers amidst laughter and clinking glasses. Her friend said sarcastically, "But does he really think she's home in bed on Wednesdays? Did you see the other guy's car parked on the corner again yesterday? She even said he's been nagging her to get her to drop everything." Muffled laughter. More comments escaped me amid the blaring of the music in my pounding heart. I froze. Part of me didn't want to believe it. But another part already knew. I'd known for days, weeks. Maybe since the first kiss she gave me with her eyes open, staring into space. The night went on. I stayed. Not out of cowardice, but out of a dignity that only those who have had the world ripped from under them can understand. I wanted to look into her eyes. I wanted to see if she still had something inside her that reminded her of who we were. I waited. I smiled falsely. And when the party ended, in the still empty parking lot, to the muffled sound of the car engine running, I looked at her. She was looking at her phone. Cold. Distant. Almost mechanical. I said softly but firmly, "Now I understand all the silences." She didn't answer. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She just looked away. And that was when I knew, she wasn't mine anymore. And maybe she never had been. The next day, I packed my bag. I left the house without shouting, without fuss. I just left the key on the kitchen table, along with a short note, "Keep everything. Except what you destroyed." I didn't know where to go, or what to do, but I knew I couldn't stay any longer. And the following days were a kind of mourning. Mourning for someone who was still alive, but not for me. I lost weight. I slept poorly. I looked through old photos and tried to understand when I stopped being enough. The pain transformed me. It hardened me. And taught me to see. For months, she stayed with her lover, showing off photos with captions about freedom, happiness, and starting over. I watched it all without reacting. But I knew it wouldn't last. Because nothing born of lies truly blossoms. And I was right. Over time, the photos disappeared. The posts became scarce. The glow she forced onto social media faded. And she was alone. Not as punishment. But because the void she tried to fill with another man was a hole she'd dug with her own hands. She discovered that what she had with him was whim, wounded vanity, fleeting desire. He didn't love her. He just liked the game. And when the game lost its charm, he discarded her. That's when she tried to come back. She sought me out. She begged for forgiveness. She cried. She said she didn't know what she was doing, that she missed me, that she'd lost herself. I listened. With the same silence she'd once used against me. I said I forgave her. But that I wasn't the same anymore. That she hadn't just destroyed the marriage, she'd erased who I was with her. And that now, someone else looked at me with truth. Someone who chose me without games, without doubts, without halves. Someone who didn't need to lose me to know what she had. She cried more. And left. She never came back. I later learned that she began living alone, in a small apartment, far from her friends, from the circles she had once proudly frequented. Perhaps out of shame. Perhaps because she could no longer bear the stares. But what struck me most was what she said to me at that last meeting, her eyes swollen and her voice trembling, "You were my safe place." But I mistook peace for boredom. I kept it silent. And I transformed that pain into strength. Today, I'm a different person. I've learned to live without her. I'm loving again. And most importantly, I'm loving myself. I found someone who doesn't need to fake happiness at parties, who doesn't trade me for crumbs of attention, who doesn't make me doubt myself. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I think about everything I've been through and realize, there are losses that save us. And there are choices that are forever. But, what did she do when she learned I'd found a new love, a true one? And what exactly made her realize, too late, that what she destroyed could never be rebuilt? The answer lies in how it all ended. And most importantly, in the way she realized, in the cruelest and most silent way, that she had lost the love of her life, through a choice she couldn't even explain. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize or support any type of cheating. All the stories you hear are fictional, but inspired by realities that show how much betrayal destroys, hurts, and leaves deep scars. Our goal is clear, to intensely reveal the real consequences of thoughtless choices. Get ready. What you're about to hear is shocking, exciting and unforgettable. Good story. They met on an ordinary afternoon, one of those encounters that seems accidental but later takes on the weight of destiny. There was no grand scene, no rehearsed words or exaggerated promises. There was just a look, steady, curious, quietly interested, and, after it, a dialogue that began shyly but stretched effortlessly for hours. His name was Daniel, and she was Laura. He was a civil engineer, discreet, attentive to detail, one of those men who notice when you change your perfume or the way you tie your hair. She was a literature teacher, passionate about stories since childhood, with a habit of analyzing every gesture as if it were part of a hidden plot. Together, they built something simple but solid. A relationship built on shared routine, Sunday lunches with their parents, impromptu trips on rainy weekends, and silences that didn't bother them. At first, everything was charming and light. Laura admired the way Daniel dealt with the world, calmly, unhurriedly, like someone who knows that everything real takes time. He, on the other hand, fell more and more in love with her intensity, the way she spoke passionately about a book she'd just read, the tears in her eyes when she heard a certain song, the almost childish way she laughed at her own jokes. They weren't a couple of surface appearances, they weren't trying to prove anything to anyone. They shared a silent complicity, as if they both knew they didn't need much to be happy, just each other. Over time, commitments came. The wedding was intimate, beautiful, filled with genuine smiles and vows that seemed unbreakable. Then came the new apartment, the shared chores, the plants on the balcony, the pictures hung together, the grocery lists shared on cell phones. The bedtime conversations, the Sundays with coffee in bed, the glances exchanged among a group of friends, as if they were the only ones. It was the kind of love that doesn't shout, that doesn't make a fuss, but fills everything, like a constant breeze, invisible but present. The two were partners, and it was evident. They were the kind of people who waited for each other at the door of work, who watched series curled up on the couch, who had inside jokes that no one else understood. Laura had artistic dreams, a desire to write her own novel, and Daniel always supported her, even when she said she might never finish anything. He encouraged her, praised her, and believed in her with a faith she herself lacked. He, on the other hand, sometimes arrived home tired from work, carrying the weight of technical decisions and precise calculations. But all it took was a touch from her, a simple gesture, and everything seemed lighter. They had a unique dance, a rhythm created by the two of them that, for a long time, seemed unbeatable. But life, with its cruel subtlety, changes everything without asking permission. Little things accumulate, almost imperceptibly. A curt response, a delay that was once explained with affection now becomes nothing more than a cold message. Laura began to get more involved with school, with her writing projects, with her new friendships. Daniel, increasingly overwhelmed by deadlines and pressures, returned home later, silent, sometimes even absent. But neither of them seemed to notice the abyss that was beginning to open up. After all, there were still kisses, there was still companionship, there was still love, or something very close to it. They had a circle of mutual friends, couples with whom they shared dinners, short trips, weekends at the beach. People with light conversation, easy laughter, shared stories. It was with them that Laura felt alive sometimes, when Daniel seemed too lost in his own world. And it was in these moments that she tried hardest to convince him to be present, to go out with her, to reconnect. He, in turn, believed he was doing the best he could, working to build a stable life, paying bills, ensuring comfort, thinking that was enough. There was no malice between them. Just weariness. And perhaps, somehow, a delusion that true love is indestructible. Daniel still looked at Laura with admiration, even when she absent-mindedly applied lipstick in front of the mirror. He still remembered her scent and the way she bit her lower lip when she was nervous. Laura, however, watched him silently sometimes, noticing how much older he had become in the last 2 years, not physically, but in his gaze. A gaze that carried the weight of routine, of responsibility, of silent surrender. They still touched, still embraced at night. But it wasn't with the same urgency, the same truth. It was almost like a reflection of what they were. There was still love, yes. But love, when left unnoticed, begins to resemble habit. And habit, when it becomes a crutch, can blind even the most passionate. Even so, there were no constant fights. There was no yelling or slamming of doors. Everything was very civilized, very subtle. They complimented each other in public, exchanged messages throughout the day, remembered birthdays and important dates. It was the kind of relationship anyone, from the outside, would point to as an example. But only they knew how far they were drifting apart. And perhaps they didn't even know it clearly. Maybe they thought it was just a phase. Maybe they hoped everything would go back to the way it was before. And, indeed, that was what they both wanted. Daniel still dreamed of a trip they'd planned years ago. Laura still thought about finishing the book she'd started with him. There were still plans for the two of them. On social media, everything remained perfect. Smiling photos, dinners, compliments in the comments. The image of the ideal couple remained intact. But inside the apartment, the silence began to echo louder than any music. Small gestures began to disappear. Coffee no longer came in bed. The loving notes stuck to the fridge disappeared. Time together on the couch was taken up by cell phones, watching series separately, or simply being tired. There was still love, yes. But love is not enough when there is no presence. When there is no listening. When there is no desire to understand the other. Laura spent more time outside, involved in literary events, coffee dates with friends, and reading circles. Daniel, on the other hand, immersed himself more and more in his work. The conversations that once flowed began to become short and formal. And what had once been complicity became a kind of polite coexistence. There were still touches, but more spaced out. There were still "I love yous," but said out of habit. There was still a shared life, but less and less shared life. And this, though subtle, is destructive. Because love requires presence. And they were slowly losing sight of each other. The house remained tidy, social commitments were still kept together, wedding anniversaries were still celebrated. But the essence was fading. Like water slipping through your fingers, unstoppable. And perhaps the greatest tragedy of all is precisely this, not realizing the end as it happens. Believing that you love each other enough to overcome any distance, any absence, any failure. But love, even the truest, doesn't survive alone. It needs to be nurtured, looked into the eyes, and cared for with intention. And it was in this scenario of polite silence, of well-established routines and emotional absences disguised as maturity, that something began to change. Something silent, imperceptible to the outside world, but brutal to those who experience it. An internal movement, an accumulated need, a choice that doesn't begin at the moment it happens, but long before, in the oversights, in the gaps, in the nights without conversation, in the hands that no longer seek each other. And it is in this fragile terrain, full of empty spaces and frustrated expectations, that dangerous decisions germinate. Decisions that change everything. That sever the invisible thread between two people. That put an end to what seemed eternal. But for now, that's all it was. A couple trying to find each other again, unaware that they were about to lose each other forever. Laura began to change subtly, like the weather before a storm that's still far away but already looming in the air. Daniel didn't notice right away, because the change came in details that, on their own, didn't scream out loud. Her hair tied back differently, her lipstick bolder, her phone facing down instead of up, loose laughter and messages she claimed were from friends, meetings outside normal hours, a different sparkle in her eyes that no longer lit up for him. And he, bogged down with work and routine, wanted to believe it was all part of a natural process. That perhaps she was simply trying to rediscover a part of herself she'd lost amid commitments and bills. There was still affection between them. There were still nights when they lay together, and even without much conversation, a hand would seek the other under the sheets. But those hands, which once held tightly, now touched as if apologizing for no longer knowing how to fit together. Laura started going out more. First, it was school meetings, then gatherings with friends, then cultural events. Daniel didn't complain. On the contrary, he encouraged her. He was the kind of husband who didn't question her because he trusted her. And perhaps, deep down, he didn't want to see what was already beginning to unfold. She seemed lighter when she returned from these outings, more animated, more present, as if she were being emotionally fueled by something he could no longer provide. And, ironically, this made him happy. Seeing Laura smile had always been his fuel. He just didn't know that smile no longer had anything to do with him. The house continued to function. Responsibilities were met, commitments were not ignored, and to the outside view, everything was in place. But an imbalance was growing within. Daniel began to notice that she avoided time together. That she put off important conversations. That she looked at him as if she were a distant friend, someone who had been part of a beautiful story but now seemed out of place. He tried to get closer, plan dinners, propose trips, resurrect memories. But she always had a commitment, an excuse, a "not now." And he, trying to respect her space, backed away. Because I still believed it was just a phase. That love would somehow return to its original form. It was on one particular night that something in Daniel began to awaken. They were invited to the birthday party of a couple of friends, those old friends who had seen them fall in love, who had been present at the wedding, and who knew their story almost as silent witnesses. Laura had dressed with unusual care. She wore a new dress, striking perfume, and impeccable makeup. He complimented her sincerely. She smiled, thanked him, but her gaze was far away. During the party, she wandered off several times. She would talk to other people, laugh with her group of friends. Daniel tried not to care, enjoying the conversations around him, but something was bothering him. A restlessness he couldn't name until he heard it. She was near the porch when she heard two familiar voices talking in low tones. One was Laura's best friend, the other a mutual acquaintance. The first said, with a quiet laugh, "He doesn't suspect a thing. She's been going out with that guy for weeks. There was even one night she didn't even sleep over, and he thought she was at her sister's house." The other replied, surprised, "Really? And she's actually thinking about leaving everything for that guy?" Her friend shrugged and said, "She says she feels alive with him. That with Daniel, everything was too predictable. But I don't know, it feels more like an escape than love." Daniel froze. The glass in his hand almost fell. He felt his whole body shudder, as if the world around him had suddenly gone silent. The laughter, the music, everything seemed to disappear. He took a deep breath. He stood still, unable to move. His heart raced, his mouth dry, and a sharp pain, like an invisible knife piercing his chest. But he didn't go after her. He didn't make a scene. He didn't interrupt the party. He waited. When they met in the car on the way back, she spoke of the event lightly, as if nothing had happened. He just listened. Watched. Didn't ask questions. Until, at a traffic light, in a silence that lasted longer than necessary, he said, "Now I understand all silences." She didn't answer. It took her a long time to breathe. It took her even longer to react. But she didn't try to deny it. And this, more than any scream, hurt Daniel irreversibly. When she got home, she went straight to the bedroom. He sat in the living room, motionless. He listened to the small sounds of the house, the creaking of the floor, the sound of the shower running, the drawers opening. He considered asking. Confronting. But everything seemed to have already been said in that look she averted upon hearing his words. And in that moment, he understood he no longer needed proof. In the days that followed, the atmosphere was unbearable. She was trying to maintain normalcy, but he could no longer pretend. They slept in the same bed, but they felt like two strangers separated by an abyss of unspoken hurt. Daniel left the house early. He avoided long conversations. He simply kept the structure standing while he decided what to do with the rubble of what had been a life together. Laura tried to smile, tried to act as if nothing had changed, but the tension was palpable. They both knew. But neither of them said it. Until, one Saturday morning, he woke before sunrise. He walked to the guest room, grabbed the suitcase he barely used, and began packing his things. Not in a hurry, not in desperation. Only with the serenity of someone who understands there is no longer any reason to insist where one is no longer seen. She found him like that, silent, carefully folding his clothes. She stopped at the door, her eyes watering, but unsure of what to say. He looked at her, not angry, not shouting, just with immense weariness in his eyes. "You don't need to explain. I already know," he said, and went back to folding a shirt. She cried. She didn't try to stop him. Because perhaps, deep down, she also knew it was inevitable. That what held them together was no longer love, but simply memory. And memory doesn't sustain a home. Daniel left home with a suitcase, his wallet, and his dignity intact. He didn't make a fuss, didn't text mutual friends, didn't try to justify himself to anyone. He just went. He began to rebuild his life silently, rebuilding a routine without her. It wasn't easy. The days were long. The nights even longer. He missed her scent on the bedsheets, her footsteps around the house, the automatic gestures of someone who'd shared their life with someone for so long. But little by little, the pain became a scar. And in the midst of this slow process, something unexpected happened. Daniel met someone. Someone who didn't know his story, who didn't look at him with pity, but with genuine curiosity. Someone who was interested in his thoughts, who laughed at his jokes, who listened attentively. There wasn't overwhelming passion at first, but there was peace. And that peace, after so much chaos, was all he needed. Meanwhile, Laura was drowning in doubt. The lover who had seemed so present began to pull away. The promises of freedom and a new beginning turned into demands and frustrations. The messages became fewer, the meetings becoming more frequent. And before she knew it, she was alone. She tried to reconnect with her old friends, but she wasn't welcome everywhere. She tried to reconnect with her own family, but there were hurt feelings there too. She considered looking for Daniel, and one day, she found the courage. She showed up at the building where he was living, unannounced. He welcomed her. He listened. She cried, begged for forgiveness, said she was confused, that she had made a mistake, that she had lost herself. He listened respectfully. But when she finished, he calmly replied, "I forgive you. But I'm not coming back." She persisted. She tried to remember the good times, the plans, the years together. But he looked at her with eyes that seemed to be somewhere else. And when she asked if there was anyone else, he replied with the same serenity as always, "Yes. And she chooses me every day." Laura cried like never before. She left with her heart broken. Not just from the loss, but from the knowledge that she had destroyed something real for a fleeting desire. And, more than that, because she had discovered something she still couldn't digest. Something that would completely change the way she viewed everything she had experienced. Something Daniel didn't yet know. But was about to discover. It took Laura weeks to process what she had done. The silence Daniel left behind was far more violent than any scream she expected to hear. It was the kind of absence that screams in the corners of the house, in the cutlery no longer set for two, in the pillow that no longer smells, in the living room light turned off earlier, in the sound of the shower that now runs only for one body. At first, she tried to convince herself that she had done what she needed to do. That she had sought her own freedom, that she was right to reconnect with a desire she had long felt forbidden to feel. But when that desire began to cool, when the other began to treat her with the impatience of someone who no longer has anything to conquer, when the heat turned to convenience and the encounters lost their luster, Laura began to understand what she had truly lost. She still saw Daniel from afar, on social media, in friends' comments, in discreet photos of places he'd started frequenting with another woman. And there was something about that woman that disconcerted her, not out of jealousy, but because of the simple, honest way she approached everything. There was truth in her gaze. It was as if she'd found in Daniel what she herself lost when she stopped seeing him as home. And it tore her apart. She tried to forget, tried to get her life back, searched for distractions in her days. But nothing fulfilled her. Her lover had left her, without much explanation, like someone who tires of a toy. She sent one last message, with no response. She called once, but he didn't answer. And it was in that moment, phone in hand, sitting on the couch in the empty house, that she understood, she was alone, and it was a kind of loneliness that has no return. She decided to seek out Daniel. Not on impulse, but out of an honest need to apologize. She wanted, at least, to say she was sorry. That she regretted it. That she now saw it. She hadn't expected him to return. But she had to try. She arranged to meet him at a cafe they knew well. He arrived with the serene demeanor of someone who no longer carries a grudge, only memories. When she began to speak, he listened. Respectfully. Without interrupting. Without irony. There was a pain in her eyes that no longer burned, but simply existed. When she finished, saying she was sorry, he sighed and replied firmly, I forgive you. But life has moved on. And now, I'm in a place where there's no longer room for what you were. She merely nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She was about to stand when he added, in a lower voice, funny, you spent so much time searching for something outside, and here I am, thinking I was the problem. She closed her eyes for a second, trying to hold back her tears. She said she understood, that she wanted him to be happy. He just smiled. A short, mature smile. Of someone who's already at peace. But something still pulsed within her. A discomfort she tried to bury since her last encounter with her former lover. A secret. A weight that grew ever heavier. Something she hadn't told her friends, or anyone else. Because it hurt. Because it was ugly. Because it revealed how much she'd lost herself. Her ex-lover was a charming, captivating man, with words that effortlessly seduced. They met at a literary event. At first, their conversation was simply mutual admiration. Then came the messages, the coffees, the meetings. He said he understood Laura like no one else. That she deserved more. That she was lost next to a man who couldn't see her. And she believed him. Because she wanted to believe. Because it was easier to blame someone than to look within. When she decided to take on the affair, even if still secret, she imagined she was changing her life. That she was starting over with someone who understood her deeply. But what she didn't know, what she discovered too late, was that she wasn't the only one. That he had others. Many. That he said the same things to each of them, with the same tone, the same intensity. That she was just another pawn in a dirty game of vanity. And more than that, she discovered he was talking about Daniel between the lines. He told mutual friends he was fixing a woman broken by a lukewarm marriage. That he was opening her eyes to the world. She once accidentally overheard a recording, an audio in which he mocked Laura's emotional dependence on him. He said she deluded herself into thinking she was going to be the great love of his life, and that the only reason she stayed was the adrenaline rush of stealing what belonged to another man. Hearing that was like falling from an absurd height. A mixture of shame, revulsion, and guilt. The betrayal, she already knew, had cost her marriage. But what she hadn't yet understood was how much it had also cost her own dignity. She kept this secret for days. She knew that telling Daniel would be exposing herself irreversibly. But deep down, she felt she needed to. Not to try to get back together. But to be honest for the first time since it all began. And it was on a cold morning that she summoned the courage. She sent a short message, "Can I tell you something? I'm not going to ask for anything. I just need to say it." He replied hours later, as politely as ever, "Sure. You can call me." And so she did. The call lasted over an hour. Laura spoke bluntly. She told how she met the man. How she became involved. How she believed she was experiencing something profound. And then, how reality dawned on her. How she discovered he said the same things to others. How he mocked her. How he used her as a trophy. Daniel remained silent. He didn't interrupt. He didn't express anger. He simply listened. And at the end, when she said in a choked voice that she felt ashamed of everything, he replied, with an almost cruel calm, "Now you understand what I felt that night. But I never laughed at you. I never treated your love as a game." The silence that followed was heavy. She wanted to say something. Anything. But there was nothing more to say. He thanked her for telling him. He said he hoped she would be well. And then he said goodbye with the words that hurt the most, "Some choices can't be taken back. But at least now, everything is clear." Laura hung up the phone feeling naked inside. For the first time, she saw the whole truth, unvarnished. She realized she hadn't just betrayed a love, she'd betrayed herself. She'd traded a man who loved her deeply for someone who'd never truly seen her. And what remained now was only the echo of what could have been. Daniel, on the other end, felt something different after the call. It wasn't relief, nor revenge. It was a kind of closure. A silent final point. He had lost her. But she had also lost something much bigger. And in that moment, he realized that not every lost love is a tragedy. Sometimes, it's salvation. But there was something Laura still needed to do. Something that could change everything, not to recapture the past, but to understand, once and for all, what had really happened. Something she would only discover by facing the woman Daniel now walked beside head-on. A few days after the call, when everything seemed to finally settle into a silence they both accepted, Laura made an unexpected decision. There was something that wouldn't leave her alone. It wasn't about Daniel anymore, nor what they'd shared, that, she was beginning to accept, was definitively buried. It was about the woman he was with now. The one who had surfaced in recent months, discreet but constant. Laura saw photos here and there, spontaneous smiles, natural gestures. And it wasn't her presence that bothered her, it was the absence of everything Laura had never known how to offer. The look that woman gave Daniel, the way he seemed so light beside her. There was truth in that relationship, and perhaps that was precisely what hurt the most. Laura needed to see it for herself, not out of jealousy or hope of regaining something, but out of a brutal need to understand how everything had changed so much, and what exactly she had destroyed. Without telling anyone, she went to the neighborhood where she knew Daniel now lived. She waited in a nearby cafe, observing the discreet activity on the street. Winter made everything grayer, and that afternoon carried a chill that wasn't just the wind. When she saw them walking hand in hand on the sidewalk, their steps synchronized and a slight smile on their faces, her stomach turned. There was nothing extraordinary about the scene. It was just a couple walking together. But what disarmed her was the way Daniel looked at her. It was the same look from before, the one he once gave her. A look of tenderness, of silent admiration, of absolute presence. Laura lowered her eyes, feeling her throat tighten. She waited for them to pass, unseen, and only then did she stand up, her hands shaking. There was nothing left to take away the pain. His life had moved on. And now, she knew it for sure. On the way back, she received an unexpected message. It was from a mutual friend who was still in touch with both of them, and who, by chance, had heard that Daniel would be participating in a public event, a debate on architecture and urbanism, hosted by a local university. He would speak about the reconstruction of urban spaces, about physical beginnings, ironically, new beginnings. Laura saw this as a last opportunity. Not to talk to him, but perhaps to hear something that would help her close her own cycle once and for all. She attended the event. She sat in the back of the auditorium, inconspicuously. He entered a few minutes later, alone. He was thinner, but with a serene expression. He spoke with ease, with a confidence she knew well. The topic was technical, but at times, his words seemed to take on double meanings. When he talked about demolishing unstable structures to rebuild on more solid foundations, when he mentioned the importance of not insisting on structures that no longer support the weight of time, Laura felt as if he were speaking directly to her, even without knowing she was there. She didn't cry. But something inside her seemed to crumble gracefully. At the end of the event, she left before he saw her. She didn't want any forced reunions, nor any more words. But that same night, Daniel received a short message, "I was there. You didn't see me. But you needed to hear it." He responded shortly after, simply with, "Thanks for coming." Neither of them said anything else. And there, the story seemed to have ended for good. But stories don't always end when we decide they do. Weeks later, Laura was called for an interview at a new school, far from where she used to work. It was also an opportunity to start over, in a different environment, with different colleagues, far from painful memories. When she arrived, the coordinator showed her around and casually mentioned that the new art teacher was also new. A friendly woman, well liked by the students, with a captivating presence. Laura smiled, dismissing it. Until, during recess, she passed this new teacher in the hallway. And froze. It was her. The woman. The one who now occupied the spot where Laura had once stood. Their eyes met for a second too long. The other woman recognized Laura immediately. But to Laura's surprise, she didn't look away, didn't show discomfort, didn't turn her back. On the contrary, he walked toward her with a restrained, polite smile, firmly extending his hand. "You're Laura, right?" Laura nodded shyly, unsure of what to expect. The woman continued, "I'm Helena. I've heard a lot about you. Don't worry. I didn't come here to cause any discomfort." There was sincerity in her voice. And a firmness Laura hadn't expected. They exchanged a few brief words, but it was enough for Laura to leave with her heart pounding. She didn't hate her. She couldn't. It was impossible to hate someone who carried so much respect in their eyes. Someone who, even without knowing it, now inhabited the most intimate places of the life Laura had destroyed. In the following days, they tried to maintain their distance within the professional environment. But one afternoon, at the end of the workday, Helena invited her for coffee. She said she wanted to clarify something. Laura hesitated, but accepted. They sat in a small cafe, far from the school. Helena began directly, "I'm not here to judge you. I know things between you and Daniel ended badly. And I only got involved with him after everything was over. But there's something you might need to know, to truly move on." Laura's eyes widened. Helena took a deep breath before continuing. "You don't know this, but Daniel was willing to fight for you until the very end. When you were barely speaking to each other, he still spoke fondly of you. He told me he thought it was just a phase. That he just needed time. He defended you, even without knowing the truth. And when he found out, when he heard from you everything that had happened, he cried. Not out of anger. But because he felt he had failed you." Laura felt a lump in her throat. Helena continued, her voice lowered, "And yet, he never let the pain turn him bitter. He told me he just wanted to experience something real, something simple. He wasn't looking to fill a void, but to build something new, from scratch. He told me about you with respect. He never tried to make me hate you. On the contrary. He said you were the deepest love he'd ever known. And that you only stayed behind because love requires a choice, and you chose something else." Laura couldn't hold back her tears. She cried there, before that woman who, in that moment, wasn't a rival, wasn't an enemy, wasn't a shadow. She was just a witness to a story she herself had destroyed. "Thank you for telling me that," Laura said, her voice trembling. Helena simply nodded. He paid the bill, stood, and said goodbye with a brief, unexpected, but empathetic hug. Laura remained there, alone at the table, staring out the window. It hurt. But it was no longer a desperate pain. It was a necessary pain. It was the end, finally accepted. The following week, he requested a transfer to another school, in another neighborhood. Not out of cowardice, but because he knew he needed a new space to start over. He left a note on his old desk, with a single sentence, "A few mistakes teach more than 1,000 successes." And he left. Daniel learned of the transfer from a third party. He didn't tell anyone. But that same night, as he walked with Helena through the quiet streets of their new neighborhood, he looked up at the sky and said softly, "Now, yes, it's over." Helena simply squeezed his hand, silently. She knew the weight of those words. And it was there, in that moment, that the story found its final note. An ending without spectacle, without forced reconciliations, without dramatic returns. But a true ending. An ending where each person moved on, marked by what they experienced, shaped by what they lost, and by what they learned. Winter was beginning to give way to milder days, but even with the clearer skies and less biting winds, Laura felt a permanent sense of a season out of time. The change of school brought a certain relief, as if the mere physical displacement allowed her to breathe more freely, but the truth is that no place was truly new when you carry the past within you. She began dedicating more time to classes, reading more frequently, avoiding social engagements. It was as if, in an almost unconscious movement, she was trying to rebuild her identity from scratch, away from the eyes that saw her as the woman who destroyed her own marriage on a fleeting impulse. Now, the students saw her only as the new literature teacher, the one who always carried a book in her bag, who wrote enigmatic sentences on the board at the beginning of class and asked questions that made teenagers uneasy. And perhaps, for the first time in a long time, she felt there was something in her that wasn't ruin, that still deserved to be cultivated. In her few moments of rest, Laura returned to her old notebooks. Manuscripts begun and interrupted, loose ideas, reflections that seemed to come from another life. She sensed, between the lines of her previous writing, a naivete that no longer existed. But she also perceived a flame, a kind of faith in love that, despite everything, was not completely extinguished. She knew she couldn't start over in the same way, but she could write from another place. A more sober, more honest, perhaps sadder, but definitely more real. She began writing regularly. Not to publish, not to prove anything, just to listen to herself. As if each word were a way of piecing together the pieces that still made sense. Still, there were nights when the memory of Daniel returned strongly, not as empty regret, but as a calm and inescapable pain. It was on those nights that she wrote most. Because it was the only way she knew how to endure the silence. Daniel, on the other hand, lived a completely different routine. Helena's presence in his life brought not only emotional stability but a kind of simplicity he had never experienced so consciously. It was a light, noise-free love. They supported each other in the little things, from making coffee to the long silences shared on the couch, which neither felt pressured to fill with words. It was in this calm space that Daniel rediscovered a version of himself he thought had been lost. He was no longer the man in doubt, trying to understand what he had done wrong, trying to mend invisible cracks. Now, he was simply someone willing to live in the present without fear of being inadequate. And, even if he didn't say it out loud, Daniel knew this peace wouldn't have been possible if he hadn't experienced the previous destruction. The pain shaped him. And, as contradictory as it may seem, it was through betrayal that he found himself again. There was a day, however, that shook the newly established balance. A literary event hosted by a local publisher would bring together independent authors and professors from various fields, including Laura. One of the texts she had written as a personal chronicle had attracted attention and was selected for public reading at the closing of the meeting. The text didn't name names, didn't expose concrete facts, but was deeply emotional. It spoke of choices, of the loneliness caused by misunderstood freedom, of love lost not through absence, but through distraction. She considered declining the invitation, but something inside her urged her to accept. Not for the audience, but because she needed to break through the last barrier of shame. She needed to allow herself to be vulnerable in front of herself. The auditorium wasn't full, but among those present, an unexpected figure discreetly appeared among the benches at the back. It was Helena. And beside her was Daniel. When Laura took the stage, her hands trembled. The warm light in her eyes made it hard to see their faces clearly, but she knew they were there. The text in her hands felt heavier than ever, but also more necessary. She read it firmly, without hesitation. And as the words came out, she felt lighter. It was a kind of veiled confession, not asking for forgiveness, but offering truth. When she finished, the silence lasted a second too long before the timid applause began. She didn't seek Daniel's gaze. Or Helena's. She left the stage and went straight backstage. She needed to breathe. And it was there, leaning against the cold wall of the hallway, that she heard footsteps approaching. It was Helena. She had a serene, almost maternal expression. She simply said, "It was beautiful." "True." Laura nodded, her voice catching in her throat. Helena hesitated, then added, "You needed this more than you know." And before Laura could respond, she turned and walked back into the auditorium. Daniel didn't appear. And somehow, Laura knew it was for the best. In that moment, she realized something new: not everything that needs to be said requires a response. Some truths are released into the air simply to exist. And that was enough. In the days that followed, Laura received messages from people who were moved by the text. None of them knew what lay behind those words. They simply said they felt touched, as if someone had put into words something they themselves had never known how to name. And that was, for her, more transformative than any reunion. She began organizing her writings, setting up a small, anonymous blog. Nothing grand, but it was a way to keep writing, to keep listening to herself. She wasn't seeking redemption, but understanding. And that, little by little, became enough. Daniel, leaving the event, commented on the text with Helena. He said he recognized every line, every metaphor. He said that, for a moment, he felt everything again. But unlike before, he felt neither anger nor longing. He felt proud of having overcome. Helena listened to him attentively, without jealousy. He knew that the past Daniel carried was part of the man he loved. And he also knew that, by embracing it with empathy, it further strengthened their bond. They walked home in silence, but hand in hand. And in that gesture, simple and repeated so many times, there was more meaning than any word spoken. Weeks passed. Laura's blog began to gain readers. People who identified with the pain, the loss, the new beginnings. One day, she received a message that paralyzed her for a few minutes. It didn't include a name, it simply said, "I've read all your columns. Now I understand more than before. I hope you keep writing. And may you be at peace." Laura didn't need to ask who it was. She knew. She smiled to herself, her eyes welling up. She deleted the message. Not because she wanted to forget it, but because she understood she no longer needed to keep anything. And so, without any grandiosity, the story took its final form. Not as a closed book, but as an open letter. A narrative of pain, choice, loss, and learning. But there was still something to happen. One last piece of this emotional puzzle that, when fitted together, would put everything in its rightful place. Something none of them expected, but which would seal their fate once and for all. Something that was yet to come. That night, after the reading at the literary event, Laura didn't sleep. It wasn't insomnia in the usual sense, it was as if her body was exhausted, but her mind was still racing through rooms, hallways, and memories. Each sentence read aloud reverberated within her like an endless echo. For the first time, she had spoken of her guilt without hiding behind euphemisms. For the first time, she didn't try to justify what she'd done, nor pretend it hadn't hurt. There was a relief, but also a profound discomfort, because bearing herself before the world with such intimate words left her vulnerable in a way she'd never felt before. Helena's visit to the dressing room, however gentle, also stirred emotions Laura had been trying to keep in check. That woman's serenity didn't hurt her, but confronted her. It was a silent lesson, the kind you can't teach, just absorb. And as she watched the dawn break through her bedroom window, she realized that, even without knowing it, Helena had forgiven her before she even apologized. And that, paradoxically, hurt her more than any grudge. In the days that followed, echoes of that event continued to arrive. People, colleagues, former students, even strangers, commented on the texts she was publishing. Many didn't know the texts were autobiographical, and this comforted her. The mask of anonymity was, for now, what allowed her to continue writing freely. But an invitation arrived by email and destabilized her. An independent publisher, specializing in confessional collections, offered the opportunity to publish a book of her writing. The proposal was sincere and admirable, they wanted her voice, her experience, her dedication. Laura hesitated for days. The idea of seeing everything printed, with her signature, frightened her more than she cared to admit. She knew that, even without names being mentioned, those who lived the story would recognize every line. Daniel, especially. Would it be fair to expose something so intimate, even without the intention of hurting? Was it ethical to transform a story of real pain into literature? She considered refusing. But deep down, she knew she was facing a moral dilemma that wasn't hers alone. It was the dilemma of someone who rebuilds themselves from their own mistakes and tries, in some way, to give something back to the world that makes sense from destruction. She decided to talk to someone who wasn't part of her past, but who knew her for who she was now. She sought out the literature teacher at her new school, an older, sensitive man who admired her writing and had obvious respect for her. He told her about the publisher's invitation, without revealing all the details of the text's origins. He listened attentively, and at the end said, "There are things that only heal when they are shared. If writing saved you, perhaps your writing will save someone else. Shame only has power over what we hide." Laura didn't respond immediately. But those words would stay with her. Meanwhile, on the other side of the story, Daniel and Helena went about their lives naturally. There were days when he didn't even think about Laura. Others, when a smell, a song, or a place reminded him of small fragments of the life he'd left behind. But these moments were no longer fraught with pain, only with memory. His love for Helena matured slowly, sustained by daily choices. And perhaps that was the key difference, it was no longer an impulsive passion, but a serene construction. The trust between them was solid, but not unquestionable. They both allowed each other space, talked about their fears, respected each other's silences. It was a more mature, more conscious relationship. And Daniel, though he didn't say it out loud, knew he'd found something rare. One afternoon, as they arranged books on the shelf, Helena mentioned the literary event they'd attended weeks before. She said she'd thought a lot about what Laura had written and that, despite everything, she admired her courage. Daniel simply nodded. After a brief silence, he confessed, "I think she'll publish all that one day." Helena looked at him curiously. "And would that bother you?" He replied calmly, "No, as long as it's true. The only thing that would still hurt me would be to see our story told as a lie." Helena smiled slightly and continued organizing the books. Laura finally decided to accept the publisher's invitation. But on one condition, that the book be published without a photo, without a biography, without any information that directly identified her. It wasn't out of fear of others' judgment, it was out of respect for those who lived the story with her. The publisher agreed. The editorial process began, and with it came adjustments, revisions, and difficult cuts. But there were also moments of reconnecting with parts of herself that Laura had forgotten. Amidst the texts, she realized there was more than guilt, there was humanity, flaws, fragility. She began to understand that making mistakes didn't make her less worthy of starting over, as long as she didn't try to hide behind them. The book was released quietly, without fanfare. The initial print run was small, aimed at niche readers. Still, the first feedback began to appear online, on literary forums, and in private messages. People thanked her for feeling understood. Others said they had changed the way they saw their own stories. And among these messages came one Laura hadn't expected. An anonymous comment, delicately written, that said, "The pain you wrote about is too real to be invented. Thank you for giving voice to what so many feel but can't express. I hope you found peace. You deserve it." Laura read it several times. And although she didn't know who had written it, she felt that message closed a cycle. Not as a forgiveness requested or granted, but as a silent acknowledgement that everyone had, somehow, survived. One night, Helena found Daniel sitting on the porch, holding his cell phone with a thoughtful expression. She came over and sat beside him. He showed her the screen. It was a review page for a newly released book. "It's hers, isn't it?" Helena asked. Daniel nodded. "I think so." Helena read the review in silence. Then she said firmly, "What she did is beautiful. It hurt, but she transformed. That's rare." Daniel turned his face to her, took her hand, and replied, "And you're what saved me from closing myself off forever after the pain." Helena didn't answer. She just laid her head on his shoulder. And there they stayed. Together. Without needing to say anything else. Later, as he turned out the lights in his room, Daniel received one last message. It came from an unknown number. It was short. It simply said, "Thank you for loving me, even when I didn't know how to receive it. I hope you're well." He stared at the screen for a few seconds. And then, with a calm gesture, he deleted the message. He knew he didn't need to reply. Because some words are spoken just to be said. And silence, in this case, was the most honest response. Meanwhile, Laura continued her new routine. He began planning a new book, this time not about loss, but about possibilities. He allowed himself to meet new people, without rushing, without exaggerated expectations. He was learning to live with the space that was left empty, not as an open wound, but as a necessary memory. Sometimes, I still dreamed about the past. But when I woke, she felt whole. And that was already more than I could hope to achieve. Their paths ran parallel. Neither would ever cross again in a profound way. But now, there was respect. There was clarity. And, most of all, there was peace. A peace achieved through pain, through truth, through difficult choices. But which, ultimately, allowed each of them to breathe easily. There was still one last bend in the road. One last moment that would forever seal what had been experienced. And that moment was about to happen. On the late afternoon that definitively sealed everything that had been built between those three intersecting paths, Laura walked through the shelves of a small bookstore where, months before, she would never have imagined seeing her own name printed on discreet spines. The book had come out in a new edition, now with her full name, her photo on the flap, and, most importantly, her story recognized not as a tale of guilt, but as a testimony of reconstruction. There, in that space among anonymous readers who leafed through the pages with genuine interest, she was no longer the woman who cheated, no longer just Daniel's ex-wife, she was simply someone who had gone through her own hell and returned with something to say. She no longer sought approval or redemption, only understanding. And it was at that point, when she stopped to sign a copy for a young woman who said she had separated after discovering her partner's betrayal, that Laura understood what it meant to be useful even in her own failings. Her pain, so deeply personal, now gained meaning in the eyes of others also trying to survive. That same week, Daniel and Helena signed a contract for their new home. It was a modest lot with an open view of the horizon and enough space for the small garden she'd always dreamed of. They had simple plans, an airy kitchen, a living room with natural light, and a bedroom with just the essentials. Upon signing the contract, Daniel looked at the still empty lot and felt a silent peace wash over him. It was unlike anything he'd experienced before. With Laura, he'd experienced the intensity of a love that seemed eternal, but lost itself in its own promises. With Helena, he experienced the tranquility of a love that didn't need to promise anything, simply present, choice after choice, day after day. He looked at her there beside him, smiling between papers and plans, and knew that, even if life still had unpredictable twists and turns, the ground he stood on was now firm. For the first time in years, there were no ghosts in his shadow. But life, even when it calms us down, still surprises us. A few days after her visit to the bookstore, Laura was invited for a live interview on a radio show. The topic was, confessional literature and the scars that inspire. She hesitated, as she always did when faced with an exhibition, but accepted. During the interview, she spoke naturally about how writing was her way of not destroying herself, about how facing her mistakes head-on was the only way to avoid repeating them. The sensitive anchor asked if she believed in a new love. Laura smiled, not melancholy, but sincerely. She said that love was no longer an obsession or a goal, but a space she left free within herself, in no rush to fill. At the end of the interview, as she was returning home on the subway, a woman sitting next to her quietly commented that she recognized her voice. She said she had read her book without her husband knowing it and that, because of him, she had decided to stay in her marriage. Laura was silent for a second, then replied that she wasn't an advice writer, but that she felt honored to have written something that helped someone else fight for what was still worth fighting for. The following night, already settled into her new home, Helena found a letter on her pillow. Daniel usually wrote her short notes, nothing too poetic, but always honest. This time, however, there was something different. He said he'd gone alone to visit the old house where he'd lived with Laura. He said it wasn't to reopen wounds, but to close memories. He said he'd sat for a few minutes on the garden bench where he'd once waited for Laura to return from a trip. He'd closed his eyes and let the street noises bring everything back, just to let go. And that, after getting up, he felt an inner door close quietly, with just the precise sound of a cycle being completed. At the end of the letter, he said, "Now I am whole again. And I choose you, for everything we've experienced and for everything that's yet to come." Helena held the letter for a few minutes before putting it away in a box where she kept everything he'd written to her. It was a simple gesture, but it held the weight of a love that knew how to wait for the right time to blossom. In a final twist, during the launch of Laura's second book, a new character entered her life. He was a young editor with a direct gaze and sharp wit. Nothing about him immediately captivated her. There was no spark or rapture. But there was respect. Genuine interest. Long conversations about literature and politics, strong coffee, and awkward silences. Over time, their encounters became frequent. He never asked about her past. He simply read what she wrote and looked at her as if he didn't need to know everything, just enough to be there. One day, during an event where they were both guests, he praised her in front of other writers, saying that her strength lay in her vulnerability. Laura, already accustomed to technical praise, felt a warmth in her chest upon hearing that. Not because she needed validation, but because, for the first time, someone was talking about her as a whole person, and not as a fragmented story. Daniel and Helena continued their routine serenely. The house gained color, simple furniture, and books everywhere. They planted a jabuticaba tree in the backyard and made a point of caring for it together. They never mentioned Laura again, not out of resentment, but because they knew the past had already served its purpose. Now it was about what they chose to plant from then on. One spring afternoon, they welcomed friends for dinner in the backyard. Smiles, relaxed conversation, a child running between the chairs, the soft sound of a guitar. Daniel looked around and thought that, despite everything, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Laura, meanwhile, was finishing the preface to her third book. This time, a collection of texts about starting over. As she typed the last line, she paused for a few seconds, staring at the blinking cursor on the screen. Then she wrote, "Starting over isn't about erasing what we were. It's about choosing who we want to be with what's left." She saved the file, closed her laptop, and, looking out the window, saw the editor standing on the sidewalk, waiting for her to have dinner. She grabbed her bag and walked out lightly. There was no more rush, no guilt, no masks. Just a woman willing to walk, this time with her eyes wide open. This was the story of a love lost, of a betrayal that tore apart what seemed indestructible, of pain that can't be avoided but faced, and of people who, even broken, learned to rebuild themselves with dignity. Comment below with your thoughts on this story. We want to hear your opinion, your perspective, and what you learned from it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue hearing real, intense stories that touch us where we sometimes try to look away. Betrayal is a choice that exacts a heavy price. It doesn't just destroy the relationship, it destroys admiration, respect, history, and the self. It leaves invisible scars on both the betrayed and the betrayer. Sometimes the pain doesn't come at the moment of the choice, but on the day one realizes what was left behind. The lesson of this story is simple: no one wins when loyalty is broken. Even if a new love emerges, the scars of the loss of a true love linger for a long time. And as always, we leave a reminder: this channel does not condone any kind of cheating. Our stories are fictional, but the feelings and consequences we portray here are too real to ignore. May each story make you reflect, and may each choice you make build, never destroy. Until next time.